When I was 13, my mom married a man named Richard. I remember the wedding vividly, not because it was a beautiful moment, but because I spent most of the reception sitting alone at a table in the corner, watching her laugh with people who barely knew me. It was like I had already been forgotten. Richard had a son, Brandon, who was 16 and had perfected the art of being both completely useless and everyone's favorite. He barely acknowledged me when we moved into their house in Chicago, except when he needed something. My charger, my snacks, my shampoo. He'd take whatever he wanted without asking, and if I complained, Mom would sigh and say, "Lauren, it's just shampoo. Stop making everything a big deal." But it wasn't just shampoo. It was the fact that I was expected to adjust to everything while Brandon did whatever he wanted. He could leave dishes in the sink, and somehow, I was the one Richard scolded for the mess. If something went missing, I was the first suspect. If I so much as left a glass on the counter, Richard would lecture me about being responsible. Brandon? He'd just shrug and go back to whatever game he was playing. Mom insisted things would get better, that we just needed time to blend as a family. But every day, I felt more like an intruder in a house that wasn't mine. A year later, Mom and Richard announced they were having a baby. That was when everything changed for good. Richard decided the house needed to be reorganized to make space for the nursery. And by reorganized, he meant my room was getting taken. "It's the biggest one," he said, like that was some kind of justification. "It makes the most sense." I stood there, gripping the straps of my backpack so tightly my fingers ached. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" "The guest room," Mom said, her tone carefully neutral. "It's a little smaller, but we'll make it nice for you." Smaller was an understatement. The guest room was barely more than a storage closet. My bed barely fit, and the only window was tiny and faced the side of the neighbor's brick wall. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Mom would just look tired. Richard would talk about sacrifices for family, and Brandon would smirk from the doorway, probably thinking how nice it was that he didn't have to move. So I moved. And then Mason was born, and suddenly, I didn't exist. Mom and Richard doted on him like he was made of glass, and Brandon used the chaos as an excuse to do even less. He dropped out of college, moved back home, and started throwing parties every weekend. The house was a disaster. Loud music, beer bottles left everywhere, random strangers coming in and out at all hours. The first time I tried to say something about it, Richard shut me down immediately. "You're not the parent here," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. Mom looked guilty for half a second before sighing. "Just ignore it, Lauren. It's not worth the fight." I wanted to ask if anything about me was ever worth the fight. After that, I stopped caring. I started staying late at school, joining clubs just to have an excuse not to go home. I studied at the library, hung out at friends' houses, picked up extra shifts at my part-time job. Home was just a place I slept. Then, one night, I came home late to find the house completely dark and silent. I walked into the kitchen, confused, and saw a note on the fridge in Mom's handwriting. "Went out to dinner. Be back later." I read it twice. I hadn't even been invited. It wasn't like I wanted to go, but something about that stupid little note hit me harder than I expected. It was proof of what I had already known deep down. I wasn't part of this family. I was just someone who lived here, and I needed to leave. I didn't leave right away. I wanted to. Every time Richard snapped at me for something Brandon did or Mom brushed me aside like I was an afterthought, I thought about packing my bags and never coming back. But I was 17, still in high school, and as much as I wanted to disappear, I had nowhere to go. So I waited. I saved every dollar I could for my part-time job. I told myself that as soon as I had enough, I'd be out of there. No dramatic exit, no screaming match. Just gone. Richard must have sensed it, because suddenly, he was more controlling than ever. He started making passive-aggressive comments about how I was spending too much time away and how family comes first. If I stayed late at school, he'd make a point of mentioning how Brandon was always around to help out, like that was some kind of competition I was losing. I ignored it. I had bigger things to worry about. Then, one night, I came home to find my tiny room completely trashed. Brandon had thrown another party while Mom and Richard were out, and this time, my room had been used as storage for people's coats, drinks, and whatever else they couldn't be bothered to take care of. My bed smelled like beer. My schoolwork was soaked through with something sticky, and my desk lamp was smashed on the floor. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding, hands clenched into fists. I was done. The next morning at breakfast, I confronted them. Brandon wrecked my room. Richard didn't even look up from his coffee. You should have been more responsible with your stuff. I blinked. Are you serious? Mom sighed, rubbing her temples like she had a headache. Lauren, it's just some things. You can replace them. I looked at her, waiting for her to realize what she had just said. That my things, my space, my boundaries, none of it mattered. She didn't. I took a deep breath and said, I'm moving out. Silence. Richard finally looked up, raising an eyebrow like I had just told him I was quitting school to join the circus. And where exactly do you think you're going? I found an apartment near campus. I have enough saved to cover the first few months. Mom's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to argue but wasn't sure how. Lauren, you don't have to do this. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Yes, I do. Richard shook his head, smirking. You really think you're ready to live on your own? I don't think I am. I know I am. That was the end of the conversation. I spent the next few days packing. Mom avoided me, barely speaking except for the occasional comment about how family should stick together. Richard acted like I wasn't even there. Brandon didn't care either way. The morning I left, Mom came into my room while I was stuffing the last of my clothes into a duffel bag. I braced myself for another guilt trip, another speech about how I was making a mistake. Instead, she just stood there for a moment before quietly asking, Do you need any extra boxes? I looked at her, trying to read her expression. It was unreadable. No, I said. I've got it. She nodded. I'll grab some old kitchen stuff for you. Plates, silverware, just so you have something. We didn't talk about what was really happening. We didn't talk about how this felt more like a breakup than a normal kid leaving home. That afternoon, I walked out of that house with everything I owned packed into 3 bags. I didn't look back. The first few nights in my apartment were strange. The silence felt too big, the space too empty. I had spent years feeling trapped in that house, but now, with no one breathing down my neck, I almost didn't know what to do with myself. But then, slowly, I started to settle in. I could come and go as I pleased. I didn't have to tiptoe around, waiting for Richard's next complaint or Brandon's next mess. For the first time in my life, I was free. And then, out of nowhere, Mom called. I should have known it wasn't just to check in. Mom's number flashed on my screen, and for a second, I considered ignoring it. But a small part of me, the part that still wanted to believe she cared, made me pick up. She started with small talk. How was school? Was I eating enough? Had I thought about visiting soon? Her voice had that overly sweet tone she used when she wanted something. I let her talk, waiting for the real reason she called. It didn't take long. So, Richard's been updating his will, she said lightly, as if this was just a casual topic. I stayed silent. He's decided to leave everything to Brandon and Mason, she continued, her voice careful, testing my reaction. Since, you know, they're his children. I let out a slow breath, gripping my phone tighter. I wasn't surprised. I had never expected to be included, but hearing it spelled out so plainly still stung. I understand, I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. She hesitated, like she wasn't expecting me to take it so well. You do? Yes. She rushed to soften the blow. Lauren, it's just legal stuff. It doesn't change how we feel about you. I almost laughed. How you feel about me? The same way you felt when you let Richard treat me like an outsider. When you let Brandon trash my space. When you went out to dinner without even inviting me. But I didn't say any of that. I just murmured, right? She changed the subject after that, pretending like the conversation had never happened. I let her. I wasn't in the mood for another argument. That night, though, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it pressing down on me. I had spent years feeling like I didn't belong, but now I had proof. Richard had made it official. I wasn't family. I should have been angry, but mostly, I just felt tired. Instead of dwelling on it, I focused on moving forward. I worked extra hours, pushed through my classes, and built a life for myself outside of them. The distance helped. I still saw Mom occasionally, but I kept things surface level, nothing too deep. It was easier that way. Then, a few months later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Lauren Carter?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm handling the estate of your great-aunt Margaret." I frowned, trying to place the name. I vaguely remembered her, some distant relative I had met once or twice as a kid. "I'm sorry for your loss," he continued, his tone professional. "She recently passed away and named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate." I sat up straighter. "What?" "She left everything to you," he said. "Her properties, investments, and a trust fund totaling around $4 million. My heart nearly stopped. This had to be a mistake. I barely knew Aunt Margaret. Why would she leave me anything, let alone everything? "She also left you a letter," the lawyer added. "It explains her decision in more detail." After we hung up, I sat there, stunned. This felt surreal, like a prank or a mix-up that would be corrected any second. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. The money was real. The properties were real. And the letter from Aunt Margaret? That was real too. In it, she wrote about how she had always admired my independence. She said she saw herself in me, someone who had to figure things out on her own, someone who had been pushed aside but refused to break. She wanted me to have the security and freedom she had never had when she was younger. It was overwhelming. A woman I had barely known had seen something in me that my own family never did. And I had a feeling they weren't going to take that well. The news spread faster than I expected. I hadn't told anyone, but somehow, Mom found out before I even had time to process it myself. She called me that evening, her voice unusually bright, the way it always was when she was about to ask for something. "I just heard the craziest thing," she said, drawing it out like we were gossiping. "Aunt Margaret left you, well, a lot, didn't she?" I didn't answer. She took my silence as confirmation. "Wow, Lauren, that must be such a shock. I mean, she barely knew you, right?" I could hear the edge in her voice, the jealousy she was trying to mask. "I guess she had her reasons," I said flatly. Mom laughed, too high-pitched to be real. "Oh, I'm sure she did. It's just unexpected. You know, your father and Aunt Margaret were very close. She always helped him out when we needed it." There it was. The setup. She sighed dramatically. "Honestly, things have been so hard lately. Richard's medical bills, Mason's school, and the house really needs some work. And with you doing so well now, I thought." "No," I said before she could finish. She paused, like she couldn't believe I had actually said it. "Excuse me? I'm not giving you money." Her voice sharpened. "Lauren, I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for fairness. That money should have stayed in the family. Do you really think it's right to keep all of it for yourself when we're struggling?" I exhaled slowly. "You mean the same family that cut me out of Richard's will because I wasn't really his kid?" That hit. She sucked in a breath, but she recovered quickly. "That was different." "It really wasn't." Her tone turned icy. "So that's it? You're just turning your back on us?" "You turned your back on May a long time ago." She scoffed. "Wow. I hope you can live with yourself." I hung up before she could say anything else. And that was only the beginning. Richard called next, lecturing me about family loyalty and how responsible adults invest in their loved ones. Then Brandon, who hadn't spoken to me since I moved out, sent a casual text like we were best friends. "Hey, we should catch up soon." I didn't respond. Then came the cousins, the aunts, the uncles, people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly full of concern for me, hinting at their own financial struggles. Each conversation followed the same pattern: fake interest, guilt-tripping, then the inevitable request for money. I ignored them all. The real breaking point came a week later when I met Mom in person. She had asked to talk, and for some reason, I agreed. Maybe I still wanted to believe she could be different. We met at a cafe, neutral ground. She barely made it through the first few minutes of small talk before getting to the real reason she had asked me here. "I've thought about it a lot," she said, stirring her coffee with exaggerated care. "And I think the right thing to do would be for you to write me a check for $1 million. I stared at her. You think that's the right thing to do? She nodded, like this was a perfectly reasonable conversation. Yes. Technically, since the money came from your father's side of the family, it should have been mine in the first place. I let out a short laugh. That's not how inheritance works. Her face darkened. It's not just about legal rights, Lauren. It's about morality. You have more than you need, and your family is struggling. I met her gaze. You didn't care when I was struggling. Her expression tightened. I fed you, clothed you, gave you a roof over your head. You took my room away from Mason. You let Richard treat me like a burden. You watched while Brandon wrecked my space and blamed me for it. She blinked, caught off guard for just a second. Then she exhaled sharply, her mask slipping. I should have known you'd be ungrateful. I didn't say another word. I just stood up, dropped some cash on the table for my coffee, and walked out. That night, the rumors started. Mom told everyone who would listen that I had stolen the inheritance, that I was hoarding money while my family suffered. Suddenly, relatives who had ignored me for years were calling, either to pressure me into sharing or to scold me for being selfish. The hypocrisy was almost funny. Almost. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I got a letter in the mail. It looked official, heavy paper, law firm letterhead. My stomach dropped as I read the first few lines. Mom was suing me. At first, I thought it had to be a joke, a bluff. But as I read through the letter, my stomach twisted. Mom was suing me for a portion of the inheritance, claiming that, as my father's widow, she was legally entitled to a share of the money. I sat there, gripping the papers, my heart pounding. Was this really happening? She had gone from guilt-tripping to straight-up trying to take me to court. I called my lawyer, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what had just landed in my mailbox. He asked me to send him a copy and called me back within the hour. This is nonsense, he said, sounding almost amused. She doesn't have a case. The will is airtight. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She knew she wouldn't win. This wasn't about legal rights. It was about intimidation. She wanted to scare me into handing over the money. I debated calling her, confronting her directly, but what would be the point? She had made it clear exactly what I was to her. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was just a potential payout. A few days later, my lawyer did some digging and found out that the so-called law firm representing her wasn't even real. The phone number listed on the letter was disconnected, and the office address led to a run-down building that had been abandoned for months. I should have seen it coming. She and Richard had probably found some shady, cut-rate scam artist willing to send a fake legal threat for a few $100. When my lawyer told me this, I actually laughed. It was that exhausted, bitter kind of laugh that happens when you realize just how low someone is willing to sink. She really thought this would scare you, he asked. She doesn't know me as well as she thinks, I muttered. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call her. I just waited. A week passed, then another, and nothing happened. No follow-up, no real lawsuit, no actual legal action. Just silence. Eventually, she must have realized her plan had failed, because she gave up on the legal threats and switched tactics again. This time, it was emotional warfare. She sent me a long, rambling email, claiming she had only taken drastic measures because she was desperate, that she was at her breaking point and didn't know what else to do. She wrote about how much she missed me, how she just wanted us to be a family again, how she had only ever wanted what was best for me. And then, at the very end, she slipped in another request for money. I stared at the email for a long time before finally closing it. I didn't respond. I was done. After everything she had put me through, the neglect, the gaslighting, the blatant attempts to manipulate me, there was nothing left to say. The calls from Richard and Brandon stopped around the same time. Maybe they had finally realized I wasn't going to cave. Maybe they just got bored. Either way, the silence was a relief. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I decided to take a break from everything. No family drama, no stress, no obligations. Just me. A few friends and I planned a road trip. Nothing fancy, just a few places we had always wanted to visit. A chance to clear my head, to breathe. As we drove down long stretches of highway, music blasting, windows down, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. about how much had changed. A year ago, I was barely scraping by in a house that never felt like home. Now, I had financial security, a place of my own, and the freedom to live my life on my own terms. It was liberating. And yet, there was still one person I hadn't completely written off. Mason. A few weeks after everything went quiet, I got a small, crumpled envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. I opened it, half expecting another attempt at guilt-tripping, but inside was a short note from Mason. "I'm sorry for asking for money. I miss you." That was it. Just 2 sentences, messy and uneven, like he had rewritten them a few times before finally sending it. I stared at the paper for a long time. Mason was only 13. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't ignored me, manipulated me, or treated me like an ATM. He was just a kid, caught in the middle of all this. I hesitated, then texted him. "Got your letter. How are you?" He answered almost immediately, launching into stories about school, his favorite video game, some science project he was excited about. No mentions of Mom or Richard. Just normal kid stuff. We started texting every few days. It was nothing deep, nothing serious, but it was something. The only part of my family that still felt real. Then, out of nowhere, Mom called again. I should have ignored it, but a small, exhausted part of me thought, maybe this time will be different. It wasn't. We met at a cafe, neutral ground. She barely lasted 5 minutes before getting to the real reason she wanted to see me. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, sipping her coffee with fake calm. "And I think the right thing to do would be for you to write me a check for $1 million. I almost laughed. "You think that's the right thing to do?" She nodded, like this was a normal conversation. "Yes. Since the money came from your father's side, it should have been mine." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "No." Her eyes darkened. "Excuse me? I'm not giving you $1 million. Her face twisted. "So you're just going to sit on all that money while your family struggles? You mean the family that cut me out of Richard's will because I wasn't really his kid?" She inhaled sharply, like I had slapped her. "That was different." "No, it wasn't." She clenched her jaw. "You've always been ungrateful." I stood up. "We're done here." I didn't wait for a response. I just walked out. That week, the rumors started again. Mom told anyone who would listen that I had stolen the inheritance, that I was hoarding money while my family suffered. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started reaching out, suddenly full of concern, hinting at their own financial struggles. I ignored them all. Richard even had the audacity to send me another guilt-ridden text about family loyalty. I responded with only one sentence. "You didn't consider me family when you wrote your will. Remember that." After that, the messages stopped. The truth was, I had already moved on. I had people in my life who actually cared about me. Friends, co-workers, even Mason, in his small way. One night, I sat down and wrote letters to each family member who had tried to manipulate me. Not for them, for me. A way to say everything I had held back for years. I told them how they had made me feel, how I had spent my entire life trying to be part of a family that never wanted me. I told them I was done. I mailed the letters and never looked back. The only response I got was from Mason. His text was simple. "Thanks for the letter. I miss you. Let's hang out soon." That was enough. I had spent my whole life feeling like an outsider, like I had to fight for a place in my own family. But now, sitting in my own home, surrounded by people who actually cared, I realized something. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was exactly where I was meant to be.